What do skulls, nickels, and muddy footprints have in common? You're about to find out on this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot. The case in this episode isn't exactly forgotten, but once again, I found that the version told today doesn't quite line up with what investigators actually had in front of them as the case unfolded. To understand what happened in 1934 in Cleveland, Mississippi, we have to go back further to 1927 in Royal Oak Township, Michigan. It was Tuesday, February 8th, 1927. Jeff Hollis and his 5 children had just moved into a run-down rental home at 266 Rymanville Street in Royal Oaks, just outside the border of Ferndale, Michigan. Royal Oaks and Ferndale are both right outside of Detroit. Rymanville Street and the surrounding area was a very low-income neighborhood, often referred to by a racist word because it served as housing primarily for Black families. The home was very modest, and by that I mean it's a wonder it was even still standing. It's described in the paper as a small tar paper shack, but it had 4 walls and a roof, which would keep Mr. Hollis and his kids sheltered from the crisp Michigan winter. The home had been empty for 5 months before they moved in. Henry Hollis, 12 years old, did what any proper boy would do and explored their new home. There were rafters holding up the roof, and the area above the rafters could be used as an attic space. Henry hoisted himself up into the rafters, and something caught his eye. It was a very large trunk. And, as any boy with breath in his lungs would do, Henry opened it. The inside of the lid was lined with blue floral fabric. The trunk was full of belongings, and on top was an old army uniform. Henry moved that aside and found some notebooks, some old letters, coat hangers, a hymnal, and down at the bottom he noticed 4 round objects wrapped in newspaper. Again, being a curious 12-year-old, Henry hoisted up one of these spherical objects in his hands and inspected it. I imagine he was just bursting with curiosity. There might just be treasure inside, just waiting for him to find. Henry peeled back the layers of newspaper and found himself staring eye-to-eye socket with a human skull. Henry informed his father, and I'm sure his father verified for himself that the skull was not a prop. Then he bundled up his children and took them out into the cold winter night to stay at his sister's house, far away from 266 Rymanville Street. On Wednesday morning, Mr. Hollis called the landlady, Mrs. Sally Robinson, to tell her of the discovery. Mrs. Robinson then called Chief of Police George W. Smith, who promptly went to the modest shack and took the trunk to the station. Sure enough, there were 4 human skulls in the trunk, each individually wrapped in newspaper. One was wrapped in a Detroit paper from March 5th, 1915, and the others were wrapped in Pittsburgh newspapers dated 1920 and 1921. Also in the trunk were various newspaper clippings with photographs of white women, and there were handwritten notes beside them. 2 had the word Hazel, along with some numbers written down. Upon further inspection, the police found that the trunk also contained lists of names of women from Detroit and Pittsburgh. He had addresses written down. Some had the word white written beside them. Several were labeled with baby, girl, or woman. They also found 2 braids. There was a blonde braid, about 1.5 feet long, matted with a substance that they first assumed might be blood. There was a shorter braid of black hair. The police asked doctors if these skulls could have been stolen from a physician's collection, and they said no, because they weren't bleached or treated in any way. In the very bottom of the trunk were found 2 nickeled instruments like doctor's tools. Finding the owner of the trunk was easy. Not only did Mrs. Sally Robinson know who owned it, but there were letters in the trunk addressed to James H. Coyner. He had lived in the home for about 3 years while working at the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, and he had moved out just 5 months prior when his job ended in September of 1926.
James H. Coyner was born around 1895 in Cleveland, Bolivar County, Mississippi. His mother's name was Letty Wheeler. He had 4 siblings, 2 older sisters, 1 younger sister, and 1 younger brother. And it was really hard to find a lot of information about this family because they were African American and their records were not prioritized back in the late 1800s or early 1900s. James had joined the Army during World War I and was an Army engineer with Company D, 510th Engineers, as part of the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF. This company was made up of solely African American soldiers. James Coyner claimed to have been married 4 times and said he had 2 children. On a draft card from World War I found evidence that he was married to a woman named Bertha. In another source, I found a woman named Alma. But there were many men with a similar name at the time, so I can't say with 100% certainty that they are the same man.
Authorities knew who they needed to talk to, but now they had to find him. They announced on Friday, February 11th, that they were launching a nationwide hunt for him, and they got lucky almost instantly. It turns out that when James Coyner left 266 Rymanville Street that September, he relocated to the vicinity of Hammond, Indiana. And within a week or 2 of his arrival, he found his way to the Oak Hill Cemetery. He located the grave of a young woman named Elizabeth C., who had died when she was just 22 years old, and then he dug her up.
He just wanted to see her.
Oh. Wow.
Dark humor.
Oh, man. Now, the thing is, this was 1926, and Elizabeth C. had been dead and buried since 1917.
That's gotta be gross.
I know. I'm so morbidly curious. I want to know what it looked like. I do. I'm not going to go dig anybody up, but I mean, I'm super curious.
Well, did they have good embalming? They embalmed then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right?
They started embalming a long time before that.
Well, I wouldn't want to see her.
Well, he wanted to. But anyway, okay, so it was September 31st in 1926 when he exhumed the body of young Elizabeth. According to the newspaper, he took her body and placed it in an abandoned house across from the cemetery. The next day, a couple of boys playing in the area discovered the body in the basement of the abandoned home, and they alerted the police. The police then watched the house, and they waited for someone to return, and on October 3rd, along came James H. Coyner.
James Coyner was arrested and charged with grave robbing. He admitted to the arresting officers that he had a craving for possessing the skulls of white women. He was convicted, and on November 29th, he was sentenced to spend the next 3 to 10 years in prison. And from there, James was sent to the Indiana State Penitentiary.
Yes, he was. And then, just over 2 months into his sentence, the trunk with the skulls was located back at his old home in Royal Oaks Township, Michigan. So the authorities have located their man, and now they just need answers. Well, James admitted to owning the trunk, but he said he had no idea where the skulls came from. And when the police asked him where the skulls came from, James said,
"It's your business to find that out."
So he was not interested in helping at all. Now, James's sister, Emma Robinson, she gave an interview on February 13th and said that she had visited James in prison on January 6th, just a month before the trunk was found. And at that time, he had asked her to go to his old house in Royal Oaks Township to get the trunk for him. He said he had his old Army uniform in there, some of his best clothes, all of that stuff. Now, Emma, when she was asked about it, she said that her brother was afraid of cemeteries, and she was certain that he didn't have anything to do with those skulls.
So where did she think they came from?
Well, James had apparently been rooming with the landlady's son, Bert. So James's sister told the newspapermen that she was certain the skulls must have come from Bert. So anyway, the Michigan police followed every lead, checking all the names in the notebook to see if they may be related to the skulls somehow. They came up empty, and on March 5th, just a few days shy of a month after finding the trunk, they decided to drop the probe altogether. Their man was already in prison, And he'd be serving time for many, many years in another state, so there was really no reason for them to keep chasing that bone.
I see what you did there.
I couldn't help it.
And I'm back at C.
Nice. All right. So the police had no missing persons in Royal Oaks or the surrounding areas to account for those skulls. There were no headless bodies lying around anywhere in the area. There were no murder cases that could account for the skulls whatsoever. And they even checked their records to look for any recent grave robberies and found that there hadn't been any in the area for like 8 to 10 years. Now, unfortunately, this story is similar to other stories we've covered where I have found that later reporting completely changed the facts. I found that his Wikipedia page actually says headless bodies had been found, and they just didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction against him. So Wikipedia actually says he is a suspected serial killer because of those 4 skulls in his trunk.
Okay, but he's a convicted grave robber, so wouldn't it make more sense that he took them from graves?
Yes, and that's exactly what the Michigan authorities believed had happened. I mean, it's in the paper. They did not think the skulls were tied to any murders whatsoever, because there were literally no murders to tie them to, period. The authorities figured that skulls belonging to a grave robber were probably from graves. And after they dropped the case, the story just went quiet.
The Salon of Warlock A. Bauer presents Genuine Lizard, the largest selection of genuine lizard footwear in Chicago. Another demonstration of salon leadership in the field of finer footwear. Shoes of the Hour, Michigan Avenue at Madison.
We need to step away from Michigan in 1927 and walk forward in time to Cleveland, Mississippi in 1934. We need to introduce you to the Turner family.
Aurelius Burns Turner was born and raised in Mississippi, and so was Eunice Luella Turner. They got married on December 27th, 1927, and eventually settled in Cleveland, Mississippi. Aurelius and Luella, as they were known by their family and friends, were 22 and 16 at the time of the wedding, respectively. Their first baby was a girl named Flora Merline, born November 2nd, 1928, just 10 months after the wedding. Their next child was a son born on January 13th of 1931, who they named Aurelius Jr., and their third was a son named James, born on January 23rd, 1933. Around 1930, the Turners had moved to Cleveland, Mississippi. He was a mule buyer for the Nelson and Riley Mule Company and was widely respected as a citizen.
In December of 1935, Aurelius was 29 years old and his pregnant wife, Luella, was 23. The kids were ages 6, almost 4, and 22 months. The young family was living in a modest house in Cleveland, Mississippi, and Luella was 6 months pregnant with their 4th baby. On the night of December 8th specifically, Luella and the little boys had gone to bed at a decent hour. Some reports say that the youngest, Jimmy, was sleeping in a crib, while others say Jimmy and Aurelius Jr. were in the bed with their mother. From what I can piece together from the coverage, it makes the most sense that 22-month-old Jimmy was in a crib that night. Now, Merline, who had just turned 6 5 weeks prior, was away that night, spending the night with her grandmother. Aurelius took advantage of the quiet house late that evening, and he sat down by the fire to read his newspaper. It was between 8:30 and 9 o'clock p.m. when an intruder walked right into the Turner home. Aurelius looked up from his newspaper, and upon seeing a giant intruder with a hatchet in one hand and a gun in his pocket, turned to make a dash for his gun. Before he could reach it, the intruder brought his hatchet down on Aurelius's head. Luella Turner had heard the commotion and came into the living room. She screamed when she saw the stranger, and he immediately brought the hatchet down upon her over and over. When he was done with her, he turned back to Aurelius, lying on the floor, and shot him once through the back of the head. The deranged intruder then carried both of the bodies into the bedroom and placed them on the bed beside each other. Aurelius Jr., almost 4 years old, had been asleep in the bed with his mother. The newspapers never did mention the details regarding young Aurelius, such as when in the timeline the attack on him fits in, but we know that the madman used his hatchet and struck the tiny boy in the head, rendering him unconscious. He left 22-month-old Jimmy untouched, and this is why it makes the most sense to me that Jimmy was likely in a crib. Next, the madman got to work with his knife. He had sharpened the blade so that it was razor thin. He began to cut into the body of Luella. He cut several chunks from her abdomen and legs and put these pieces of flesh into a gunny sack. He then used his knife to remove her 6-month pregnant uterus from her body and placed it onto the bed beside her. And then the man slipped back out into the night, leaving the gruesome scene to be found the next morning. At 7 o'clock the next morning, now December 9th of 1935, a black woman by the name of Alice Grimes arrived at the Turner home right on time. She worked as a house servant for the Turners. When she walked in, the carnage was obvious. Aurelius Jr. was still unconscious from the blows to his head, but he was alive. Both boys were half frozen without having anyone to tend to the fire overnight. The papers say that they were both suffering from exposure. Alice immediately notified the neighbors, Albert Henderson and John Burtnett. They, in turn, were able to alert the authorities. Aurelius Jr. regained consciousness somewhat later that day and told the police what he saw. I don't know for sure what he said other than it was a giant. But he is quoted as saying, "It was a big man that did it. I don't know who it was. I'm going to kill blank because he killed my mama and daddy last night." There was simply a dash there rather than a name. However, something he said made the police think that perhaps Albert Henderson, a 21-year-old neighbor, might be the guy. 8 years later, in a newspaper article written by Peter Levins for the Daily News in New York, that dash was filled in with the name Albert. He was taken into custody and questioned, but it was ultimately determined that he had no involvement. Then Albert Henderson served as a pallbearer at the funeral on December 11th. Now, we need to wonder if little Aurelius actually said he would kill Albert, because the rest of this article from 1942 is full of absolute fictional trash. But I just wanted to let you know that there is one spot in 1942, 8 years later, where a guy in New York removed the "I don't know who it was" part of the Aurelius Jr.'s quote, and then filled in the blank with the neighbor's name. And it may very well be that Aurelius Jr. named him, because they did arrest him with a swiftness and asked him questions before quickly ruling him out as a suspect.
He also was 4. So, and would he actually be like, "I'm going to kill this person" as a 4-year-old?
Well, I mean, he might have. I mean, I could see, like, that's what I would do if a bad guy came in. You know what I mean? Just, you know. But also, he had been asleep and then wakes up to this right before being, like, clubbed in the head and going unconscious. So, I mean, very small window. And then with the brain, injury, you know. So, anyway, back to 1934. Sheriff E.D. McLean was one of the lawmen to arrive at the scene. Now, he also happened to be a physician, and he was able to determine that the Turner couple had been dead for 6 to 8 hours before being found by Alice Grimes. McLean determined that robbery likely wasn't the motive because Aurelius had 85 cents in his pockets, and it looked like nothing was taken from the house. They called in some bloodhounds to try to track the culprit, but the dogs were not able to pick up a scent at all. And in true 1934 style, hundreds of Mississippians were allowed to walk right into the Turner home to view the bodies.
What?
Hundreds of citizens saw that flesh had been cut away from Mrs. Turner's legs and abdomen. Hundreds of people saw the pregnant uterus lying on the bed beside her.
I'm sorry, what?
Gross.
I mean, can you imagine? I mean, it's just weird to be like
walking in and be like, "Oh, look, a uterus."
Like, well, the thing is, it made them all very, very angry, and they were like, "When we find who did this, we're going to get our own justice. They're not even going to take this guy to court. Look at that, that was."
Yeah, it's still gross.
But it's still wild to be like, "Come on in through this crime scene, check it out.
Look at all the flesh cut away."
Well, Cleveland, Mississippi was a very small place, and the authorities knew they were going to need some help. Detective Sergeant Morris Solomon and Detective Roger Kennan, both from Memphis, flew down on the 9th to lend a hand in the investigation. And then Major T.B. Birdsong, who was the chief of police in Clarksdale, he also came to assist, as did Chief Deputy Hunter Scott of Coahoma County. So they had a lot of outside help coming in to assist them with this because this was huge. Now, at least by December 17th, 9 days after the murder, the police were pretty certain they knew exactly who had done this terrible deed, and they had officers over in Shreveport, Louisiana, on the lookout.
A former soldier by the name of Rufus Lee Roy was under arrest in Louisiana on December 18th, and he was transported to Memphis, Tennessee. That is where Inspector W.T. Griffin was waiting to question him. Rufus Lee Roy was born February 16th, 1895 in Louisiana, when both of his parents were 40 years old. He was the youngest of 6 siblings. In 1917, 22-year-old Rufus enlisted in the Kentucky National Guard. At that time, he listed a home address in Fulton, Kentucky. He was discharged from the National Guard for a disability just a few months later. In 1921, he re-enlisted under the fake name Roger L. Roy over at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. Again, he was discharged after just 24 days when he contracted tuberculosis. He received compensation from the military after this, and records from the Department of Justice show that he received checks in Lexington, Kentucky, St. Petersburg, Florida, Little Rock, Arkansas, Jacksonville, Florida, and at a small town in Colorado. In 1932, Rufus, at the age of 37, married a 15-year-old girl by the name of Louise Elizabeth Turner. The marriage license was announced in the March 17, 1932 edition of the Clarksdale Press Register in Mississippi. They moved west and got divorced shortly thereafter. Eventually, he remarried a woman named Ruth, and they divorced later as well. His first wife, the 15-year-old by the name of Louise Elizabeth Turner, was the younger sister of Aurelius B. Turner. Detective Sergeant Morris Solomon was one of the men from Memphis who had gone to Cleveland to assist in the investigation. He sent a report about the crime to Inspector Griffin in Memphis. Inspector Griffin then told Detective Solomon to look for a man who is not normal. The paper says that they did a checkup on all such persons in and around Cleveland. And then Inspector Griffin sent a telegraph to Shreveport, Louisiana, to tell the authorities there to watch for Rufus Lee Roy. The Shreveport officers were given pictures of Rufus, and they were on the lookout. It was on the morning of December 17th, 1934, when Deputy Sheriff Steve C. Norris saw a man walking on the outskirts of Shreveport. Deputy Norris was actually in plain clothes at the time, so Rufus didn't realize it was an officer. Rufus asked the officer for a ride. The officer recognized him as Rufus Lee Roy right away, and he was taken into custody for questioning. The officer asked him for his name, and he said that his last name was Beard, before admitting his true identity.
Yeah, and it just makes me laugh. They're like, okay, look for someone who is not normal. And so they checked up on all of the not normal people. They just have a list of the not normals. It's kind of funny. It turns out Rufus Lee Roy had spent some time in a mental hospital for a while. So maybe they meant like mental patients. But in the paper, it was literally a quote, a man who is not normal, and quote, a checkup on all such persons.
Interesting.
I know. It's so crazy. Anyway, I really wonder why they thought of Rufus in the first place, because there's nothing in the papers that says what, initially tipped them off to him. Well, according to the papers, upon his arrest, Roy actually said,
I guess I'm the one that did it.
He later denied making any such statement. And in addition to that denial, Rufus also denied any connection with the Turner murders whatsoever. He insisted that at the time of the crime, he was in Shreveport, Louisiana, not Cleveland, Mississippi. These two cities are 247 miles away from each other. So that's a big distance. Inspector Griffin scoffed at Rufus's assertion that he was in Shreveport at the time of the murder.
We know that he was in Cleveland on the day before the murder and the morning after the murder. Mr. Turner was shot with a .38 caliber revolver, and we know that at one time Roy owned such a revolver. I cannot say whether he has had it recently.
Inspector Griffin then pointed out that Rufus Lee Roy was only making himself look more guilty by saying that he was elsewhere.
Why does he alibi so soon? We haven't accused him of a crime.
I think if I was told I was going to be questioned about a murder, I would also tell them if I wasn't even in the area.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it was too soon to say that to me either. So I don't know, it just makes me shake my head. Anyway, well, it turns out that one glove had been left at the scene of the murder, and it was similar to gloves that Rufus owned. But even so, the paper did say that the glove from the scene was not identified as belonging to Rufus. Not yet, anyway.
Hate to study? Poor light makes studying twice as hard and may do young eyes real harm. Reading and writing and arithmetic. Hard enough for a normal youngster to enjoy without being handicapped by poor light. Your child may not know what the trouble is, but you can depend on this. The dimmer the light, the longer she'll take to study, and the more chance of serious eye strain. The same applies to your own eyes, too. Good light is cheaper than eyesight. Protect it. Try this beautiful scientifically designed study lamp in your own home today. Only $5.95. 95 cents down, $1 per month after that. Sense the instant relief from glare and eye strain that proper light brings. Provide for the kiddies and for all the family. Better light, better sight. Mississippi Power Company.
By December 20th, Rufus had been moved to a Memphis jail and was questioned for almost 20 hours about the double homicide and mutilation of the Turners. Then a man named J.N. Daniel went to see Rufus to ask him about the kidnapping and murder of Dorothy Distelhurst in Nashville, Tennessee, which happened earlier in September.
Ooh, do you think maybe he was a serial killer?
Well, that's what they're starting to think. But much to their disappointment, by December 22nd, they were unable to link him to the Distelhurst case. They were also frustrated that they couldn't directly connect him to the Turner case either. They just needed to go harder on him with their interrogations. So the papers report that the officers who were interrogating him would be exhausted after the long hours they spent trying to get him to slip up. And yet Rufus was as fresh and calm as he was just before his arrest. Different officers would come in to take their crack at him, but they would wind up empty-handed.
This guy sounds like he's tough. He's tough as nails. Because interrogations were like beating people up back then.
Right? Yeah. Yes, they were. So, yeah, it's crazy, but he stood his ground. Holy moly. So then they brought in a couple citizens of Cleveland who said that they had seen Rufus in Cleveland in the days before and after the murder happened. So they transported these witnesses to Memphis, all the way from Cleveland. And first up was Mr. H.B. Doris, who had actually known Rufus for a long time. So he's face to face with Rufus in the jail, and he tells Rufus, like, I am positive I saw you on the streets of Cleveland on December 8th. And that was the afternoon before the murders. And very calmly, Rufus responded with, you are mistaken. I was in Shreveport that day. Another 3 witnesses from Cleveland were brought in, and these 3 actually took a look at Rufus Roy and said they were pretty sure he was not the man they saw after all.
And Monica, as we both know, we gotta be honest here. Rufus Roy has a very memorable face.
It is very, very unique. I think it would be very hard to mistake him for someone else.
Yes, we will post pictures and you will see what we mean. Face of a demon.
Oh, no, this is not a demon face. This is like a caricature. I swear there are cartoon characters that were created after his face.
He's an odd fellow.
He is incredibly odd. All right. Anyway, so some doctors finally came in to superficially examine Roy, and they must have been psychiatric doctors because their reports are more about his mental cunning than anything physical.
He has a shrewdness of a kind and is quick enough to anticipate the questions that the officers are asking him,
said Dr. Johnson. Inspector Griffin from Memphis had gone to Shreveport, Louisiana to question the witness as well. And he stated on December 20th that they had not given up yet.
But as of yet, we have been unable to disprove Roy's alibi. We are going to every place and person that he has mentioned, and will be sure of his guilt or innocence before we dispose of the case.
On Friday, December 21st, 1934, Rufus Roy was officially charged with murder. He still swore he had not been anywhere near Cleveland at the time, but the authorities were positive. They now had 5 Cleveland residents who positively identified him as someone they had seen in Cleveland. Jesse Watts and Upton Walker both said they saw him in Cleveland on December 6th. The other 3 were Henry McGarr, James Edward McGarr, and an E.D. Halliburton. All 3 of these men said they'd seen Rufus on the 8th, which was the afternoon prior to the murders. Rufus insisted there was no way he could have been in Cleveland. He had mailed a letter to the government from the Shreveport post office at 4 o'clock on the 7th, so the witnesses were all mistaken. The officials in Washington, however, said they had not received any such letter. The authorities continued to hammer him with questions, but Rufus Roy would not budge. On December 28th, they finally moved Rufus from the jail in Memphis to the Cleveland, Mississippi jail. District Attorney Greek P. Rice would then be handling the case, and still Rufus professed his innocence. He comes under more and more questioning, and according to Rufus, things got pretty rough. He said that his nose was broken and he'd been slapped and spat upon.
See? They beat him up there.
Yeah, they do.
Meanwhile, for several months prior to this, there had been another investigation going on in Cleveland, Mississippi. Several prominent women living in Jackson, Mississippi, and more women living in Indianapolis, Indiana, had been making complaints about receiving terribly obscene letters in the mail. The letters all originated from the Cleveland, Mississippi post office. Postal Inspector T.R. Rock took up the case to try to track down this menace. He soon realized that there was a man by the name of James H. Coyner who regularly received a newspaper from Indianapolis, Indiana, and had it sent to him there in Cleveland, Mississippi. This was a good connection to the obscene letters because most of the women receiving the letters in Indiana had been recently named in that newspaper. Postal Inspector Rock and Deputy Sheriff Charles Maddox sat and waited for this mysterious James H. Coyner to come and collect his paper.
By the second week of January, Rock and Maddox were ready to take Coyner into custody.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a special bulletin. Word has just been received that Miss Amelia Earhart has safely landed her Lockheed monoplane in Oakland, California. Completing an unprecedented solo flight from Honolulu, she becomes the first aviator to successfully cross the Pacific from Hawaii to the mainland United States. Battling shifting winds and uncertain skies for more than 18 hours, Miss Earhart has once again demonstrated the bold spirit of American aviation. Crowds have gathered at the airfield, and telegrams of congratulations are already pouring in from across the nation. This marks another milestone in modern flight and in the progress of women in the skies. We now return you to your regularly scheduled program.
It was now January 12th, 1935. Inspector Rock and Deputy Maddox were at the post office watching for Coyner when suddenly in walked a very large black man. 39-year-old James was 6 foot 4 inches and 240 pounds. As soon as he had his hands on that newspaper, Postal Inspector Rock and Sheriff Maddox made their move. They had him cuffed, and then they searched his pockets. In one pocket, they found a gold Elgin watch. In the other was something revolting. There was a piece of flesh in his pocket, a piece of human flesh. The Turners had been dead just a little over a month. The police quickly realized that this was likely the man who had murdered the young couple and attacked 3-year-old Aurelius Jr. There was an immediate concern. Once word got out that the culprit was a black man, the citizens of Cleveland would likely attempt to lynch him. This was 1934, after all, and because hundreds had seen the body of Luella Turner, word had spread far and wide about the animalistic brutality. The citizens had already been planning a lynching, even before they knew who was guilty of the crime. Sheriff McLean was not about to allow his suspect to be taken by an angry mob, so James Coyner was swiftly and secretly transported from Cleveland over to Jackson, Mississippi. The jail in the capital city was mob-proof. When the officers moved their captive through Greensville on their way to Jackson, that was the first anyone had caught wind that someone else was in custody for the crime. This was as hush-hush as possible. Meanwhile, poor innocent Rufus Leroy was cleared of all charges and released from the Cleveland jail. He later went on to sue for the maltreatment he'd suffered at the hands of the law. He sued them for $30,000 and was eventually awarded $6,000. Meanwhile, officers went to the home of Letty Wheeler, James Coyner's mother. She lived on a farm just outside of Cleveland. Her address was technically Boyle, Mississippi. At this home, inside of a suitcase, they found more than 50 obscene letters already addressed and ready to be mailed. They also found pieces of flesh. They were salted and cured. One piece actually had a bite taken out of it.
I want to know how she didn't know that.
I don't know. She was 74 years old, so she may have just been doing her own thing. And I don't know. It also sounded like he had a shack. He was staying in a shack that was just on her farm land. So it may have been in a separate area, so she was just not aware anyway. But, all right, so the gold watch that had been in his pocket upon his arrest, it was positively identified as Aurelius Turner's watch.
The Elgin National Watch Company was big between 1864 and 1968. They were known for railroad-grade timepieces and brands like Lord Elgin. For about 100 years, they operated the world's largest watchmaking complex. Most Elgin watches have a serial number on the movement itself, not the watch case. The serial number can be used to identify the year it was made, the grade of the materials, and the size.
And that serial number is exactly how they knew that the watch in Coyner's pocket had belonged to Aurelius B. Turner. As for the flesh, well, there was only one person in Cleveland who had flesh carved out of her, so it was an easy assumption to make. Just for good measure, they ordered an exhumation so they could match the pieces of flesh to the parts of the body where the flesh was missing. It turns out that James Coyner had been paroled from the Indiana State Penitentiary in June of 1934. He stayed in Indianapolis for a very short amount of time and then headed back to his hometown of Cleveland, Mississippi, to live with his 74-year-old mother, Letty Wheeler. He had served 7 years and 7 months for his grave robbery conviction. As for this crime, James wouldn't admit to it. In fact, he wouldn't answer a single question whatsoever. He literally sat in silence. County Attorney E. H. Green finally gave up trying to get information out of him and told the newspapers,
"We might as well have been talking to a post. I'm convinced we've enough evidence anyway to hang him."
2 days after his arrest, on January 14th, Michigan had caught wind of the arrest, and it reminded them about those 4 skulls they'd found back in Royal Oaks Township in February of 1927. Now that he's out and in trouble for murder, they decide it's a good time to take another look at those skulls. That same day, Michigan officers were on their way to Jackson, Mississippi to ask more questions. He would admit that he'd spent time in prison for grave robbing, but that was all they could get out of him. On January 15th, Sheriff McLean had been over in Jackson trying again in vain to get Coyner to confess. He went back to Cleveland without a confession. It was January 16th when things changed. James Coyner had been told that his mother, age 74, had been taken into custody under suspicion of having knowledge of the crime. He was told that since he wouldn't talk to them, they'd have to get everything they could out of her. This was too much and suddenly had James talking up a storm. He was clearly agitated and began to cry.
"She's innocent of any knowledge of this crime. Call the district attorney back. I'll talk."
District Attorney Greek P. Rice of Clarksdale and Sheriff E.R. McLean, as well as several other deputies, made the long trip back to Cleveland to the jail in Jackson. It was the night of Wednesday, January 16th.
First, he made the lawmen promise that they would release his mother from the Cleveland jail, as well as provide her with protection in case anyone tried to harm her to get back at him. It was only after securing this promise that he began to talk.
He spent several hours telling his entire life story, beginning with his true given name, Alonzo Robinson. He gave a weird recital of his abnormalities and ghoulish activities.
And that's a quote. That's what they put in the paper. A weird recital of his abnormalities and ghoulish activities. Back when grave robbing was not uncommon, they referred to grave robbers as ghouls, like ghosts, goblins, and ghouls, that kind of ghoul.
Interesting.
Yeah.
When asked why he killed the Turners, he admitted that he had never even seen them before that night.
I just had an impulse to kill somebody.
He calmly told the district attorney. When asked why he chose the Turners specifically, he said,
I can't give any reason for it.
He was sitting in a jail corridor with his hands cuffed behind his back as he recited the events of the night of December 8th. He said that he went into the home between 8:30 and 9 with a hatchet in his hand and a gun in his pocket. He first attacked Relius when he looked up from his paper. Then he struck down Luella when she came in and screamed, and then he shot Relius for good measure. He explained how he placed the bodies on the bed and took out his pocket knife that he had thinned to razor sharpness. He explained that he first intended to cut up the bodies and burn them to conceal his crime, but for some reason he changed his mind. He wrapped the bloody hatchet in a piece of paper. Then he took pieces of Luella's body and put them in his gunny sack. He left the home with his gruesome bundles, he said, and walked down the railroad tracks and through a residential section of the town until he got to his shack on his mother's farm. There was a fire going. He threw in his one cotton glove, the other being left at the crime scene, and he broke the wooden handle off of his hatchet. He threw both the handle and the head of the hatchet into the fire. He wanted the blood to burn off of the hatchet's blade first, and then he put the blade into a bucket on the back porch of the house.
Why did you cut portions of flesh from the woman's body? Oh, I took the skin to see how it felt. Did you bite this piece of flesh? Yes.
He was then asked if he had killed 4 women in Michigan, referring to the 4 skulls in the trunk.
No, I stole the heads from the graves. The heads were the only things in the graves.
Wait, okay. 4 different women had just been buried with only their heads in the graves, and that's it?
Okay, I have a theory about this. So he had been convicted of grave robbery after being caught with the remains of Elizabeth C. in 1926, and he got 3 to 10 years. The articles about that only said that he had dug her up and was going to take her remains to his shack in Indiana. But there were a few other articles then in 1927, as well as later on in 1934, that specified that he had actually dug her up so he could sell her body to a medicinal school. So there were a few that mentioned that there was also he was also selling bodies to medical schools.
Mm-hmm.
And even after his confession to the Turner murders, there were articles that said he'd previously been convicted for digging up bodies and selling them. So these were after the fact articles, though. They were not written while he was on trial for grave robbery. So I can't say for sure that this is the reason why he had dug her up, but there were also articles after this that said the Michigan authorities were pretty sure he had sold the rest of the bones to medicinal schools and he had just kept the heads.
Interesting. That makes sense. Because I don't know, I was listening to a podcast, but that makes sense. And he probably didn't want to admit to that because he didn't want to get more prison time.
What do you mean you're listening to a podcast?
Oh, I was listening to a podcast about people who would dig up bodies to sell them. Like medical students would actually dig them up too.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Like the teachers would be like, we need a body. And so the students would go out and dig them up.
Oh my gosh, that is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, grave robbery used to be pretty common. I mean, that's what they had names. They were called ghouls. I thought when I first saw stuff calling him a ghoul, I was like, is that like a racist term or something? And so I had looked it up and then it was like, oh no, that's just what they called people who would rob graves and stuff. Like, oh, okay.
That's interesting. I wonder where they got ghoul from, grave robber.
Yeah, I don't know. And now we still say it, like ghosts, goblins, and ghouls,
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, we don't know why. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's where it came from, I guess.
Next Halloween, we'll dive into why things are called what they are.
Yeah, maybe. So anyway, now he had done almost 8 years for digging up one body, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not having sold it to anybody. He didn't actually sell it. But if he were to admit that he'd done it with these 4, maybe he would be facing like that same lengthy sentence, but 4 times over. So that may be why he just wanted to say, oh, the heads were the only thing in there, because he didn't want, to risk that. So that's my theory as to why he said the heads were the only things in the graves. Or maybe they were. Maybe the bodies had been taken by medical students.
You never know.
Yeah. Wonder how many old graves are empty.
Well, there was in this podcast episode I was listening to, this kid like climbed up a ladder and looked into the medical college where they were doing some dissections. And one of the students looked at him and was like, oh yeah, this is your mom. And then it turns out his mom had just died and her body was stolen.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, dang.
And so then the kid told his dad, and the professor, like the main doctor, was like, everyone, you gotta run. And then so they got the main professor, but.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was like,
That's crazy. Yeah. Well, also, in his confession, he told the authorities where they could find more pieces of Mrs. Turner's flesh. And he did tell them, however, that one piece had been, quote, lost.
I'm going to assume that means he ate it.
Those are my thoughts. Because, I mean, how do you just lose a piece of person? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, don't know where that one went. But anyway, he told them where the rest would be. Some was actually located in a crib that was under some hay in his mother's barn. So he had just kind of stashed it around.
In a crib.
Yeah. I wonder if it was the one he had been in when he was a baby.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Now, he was asked if he had an accomplice, and he said no. The authorities initially doubted this because the cutting of the body was done with such precision that they thought someone skilled in surgical procedures must have done it. But he insisted, he had done it himself. He worked alone. There was nobody with him. Sheriff McLean confronted him about this. There had been a pillowcase that looked as if it had been held down under the body to collect blood while Coyner was, cutting the womb out of his victim. And so he said, surely you couldn't have held the pillowcase there while doing this procedure. And nobody had enough hands for that. And then Coyner said that actually he had just simply put the pillowcase over her head to keep himself from being sprayed by the blood while he was doing it.
Which doesn't make sense why he's not cutting near her head.
Well, if there were, gashes up there so that it was making it come out, that's the only thing I can imagine. I have not reenacted this. Don't worry, guys. That's just my imagination. That's the only thing I could think of. I was like, huh? I spend way too much time thinking about all of these things, I swear. Anyway, so when he was done with his confession, which was either 80 pages or 60 pages, I saw it both ways, and I really want those pages.
I looked.
Yeah. Well, I asked a person who works at the Historical Society in Bolivar. Yeah. I did not hear back about that, unfortunately. But anyway, so so the 80 or 60 pages was handed to a stenographer on the night of the 16th, and it was typed up and brought back to him on the morning of the 17th, and that is when he signed it. Now, immediately after signing the confession that morning, Sheriff McLean and the other men left for Cleveland to make their plans for a speedy trial. They wanted this man to hang as soon as possible. By January 22nd, the newspapers had all caught wind of his true name, Alonzo Robinson. He honestly had not gone by that name in a long, long time. His sister had called him Jim, and even the sheriff and his deputies called him James. Alonzo Robinson had been his name when he was born, but he'd been James H. Coyner for a long time since. The newspapers would kind of go back and forth on what they called him. From that point on, it was mostly Alonzo Robinson, also known as James H. Coyner. But it seems like, from what I can gather, that just was his name, James. But anyway, so everyone in Jackson and the surrounding areas, they wanted to catch a glimpse of this cannibal ghoul after his confession was made public. And he became quite the attraction. To actually see a person with your own eyes who could do what he did, like, that was too much to pass up for them. I don't know if I would want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so James decided he was going to cash in on his new notoriety. He actually erected a blanket in his cell, and he stood behind it until every person standing on the other side of the bars tossed in a nickel.
5 cents in 1935 had the spending power of $1.21 in 2026 money.
Yeah. So he was asked what he wanted all the money for, and he said he was saving up for cigarettes. But by the 22nd, he had far, far surpassed the cost of cigarettes, and they began to wonder if this was maybe his last-ditch effort to somehow provide for his aging mother. But it didn't really matter what he was really up to. The people kept coming, and the nickels kept rolling in.
See Dr. Dick. Dr. Dick is honest, faithful, rich, mellow. The doctor knows what's good for you. Dr. Dick, straight whiskey. Dr. Dick whiskey won't leave you hanging.
The trial was slated to begin on February 4th, and all of the lawmen in Cleveland were more than a little nervous. They had asked Mississippi Governor H Coyner to send in the Mississippi National Guard to make sure the defendant could be safely transported from Jackson to Cleveland, and safely make it into the Cleveland jail, then safely move from the Cleveland jail to the Cleveland courthouse, and then have a fair and safe trial. They wanted him to be safely convicted of murder and then safely be sentenced to die at the end of a rope.
And safely hung.
Exactly.
And not strangled, but neck broken. Safely.
In the most safe way possible. In all seriousness, though, they did not want mob violence. They did not want a bunch of angry citizens to take the law into their own hands and circumvent due process and all of that. Mississippi was working on becoming more civilized in that regard, or at least the people in charge wanted them to be working on that.
Did you know that between 1877 and 1950, there were about 600 lynchings in Mississippi?
It's a very dark part of our country's history, for sure. So, this being 1935, lynchings were still very much a thing. So, yeah, the governor called in the National Guard, and they took this very seriously. The first to arrive was the local contingent, Company F of the 155th Infantry. 50 troops from Clarksdale headed to Cleveland that afternoon. Throughout the day, guardsmen from Corinth, Grenada, Water Valley, and other North Mississippi towns continued to arrive. 25 National Guardsmen from the Mississippi coast came as well. There were 2 officers and 20 enlisted men from Company M, 155th Gulfport Unit, plus there were 2 officers and 1 enlisted man from Battery F, 114th Field Artillery. These units, rather than going to Cleveland, where the trial would be held, they instead made their way to Jackson, where the defendant was sitting in the mob-proof jail. Company L of the 155th Infantry also went to Jackson. They would form part of the escort from Jackson to Cleveland. Major T.B. Birdsong from Clarksdale assisted General Thomas Grayson in the command of the Guard Patrol and Activity.
I love his last name, Birdsong.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. The troops who had gone straight to Cleveland had a lot of preparations to make. They turned the Bolivar Courthouse into a war scene. Barbed wire entanglements were placed around the building so that there was only one way for people to enter or exit the grounds. Sandbags were thrown up within the perimeter of the barbed wire. Behind the sandbags were squads of expert riflemen armed with riot guns, machine guns, and rifles. On the roof of the courthouse were 4 machine guns, manned by a platoon of practiced gunners. There were soldiers marching through the streets of Cleveland with rifles. There were outposts stationed throughout the town, and the Signal Corps had erected a telephone communication system connecting the various groups and the high command inside the courthouse. Cleveland was fully fortified, and loitering in the vicinity of the courthouse was strictly prohibited. The people had been warned.
All in all, there were 600 troops deployed to guard James H. Coyner and keep him from being the victim of a crazed mob. And this may come as a shock, but because of this gigantic military presence, the citizens of Cleveland were quiet and orderly. Still, the military folks were taking no chances. At about 9:30 p.m. on the night of Sunday, February 3rd, the transfer from Jackson to Cleveland had begun. James was taken down the small jail elevator from his cell on the 5th floor of the Jackson jail and put into a waiting car in the basement. The car then backed out of the basement and drove behind a car from the local city police department. The platoons marched alongside and behind the two cars all the way to a waiting train. James was placed in the barricaded all-steel mail and baggage car on the troop train. Nobody in Jackson had any idea that this was going to take place, so there were no crowds gathered at the jail to watch. Before the troops could board the train, they were drilled in the use of their gas masks by chemical experts. They had this new kind of gas that they didn't use in war, and this gas would make a person violently nauseated and just render them helpless. Now, once he was safely in the baggage car and all the locks were sealed, James and all of the troops were highballed all the way through Vicksburg, Greenville, and all the other points along the regular Jackson-Cleveland route of the Yazoo and Mississippi Valley Railroad until they reached their destination. It was 151 miles from Jackson to Cleveland. James talked to soldiers for most of the way, but he slept for the last hour of the trip. The train pulled into Cleveland at 4 o'clock a.m. on February 4th. And again, nobody in town knew that this was happening, so there were no crowds gathered at all. Guardsmen kept the path clear from the train to the courthouse. James had been awakened and then loaded onto a large army truck. A squad of guardsmen were in front and another behind, and they made their way together through a quarter-mile lane of soldiers to the jail that sat beside the courthouse. He was hustled quickly from the truck to a cell on the 3rd floor of the Bolivar County Jail in Cleveland. This cell had a burglar-proof lock that would only open with a key that was a foot long.
Whoa.
Which, I know, I'm trying to, imagine that. Now, outside of the cell were 2 guards. And the first thing he did when he got into the cell was roll a cigarette, and then he hummed and sang to himself while guardsmen in the yard below stopped to listen.
Do we know what he was talking about on the train?
Well, yes, they talked about that in the paper, so it's kind of funny. So he was actually incredibly smart. He was a very educated, intelligent man, very deep thinker. And he was talking to them about predestination and philosophy. He named a couple of his favorite philosophers and everything. But he said that he was a fatalist, meaning that he believed in fate and he believed that nobody could change their fate. You all have, a destiny and that's it. And in his mind, the murders of the Turners were just meant to happen and nobody could have stopped it. What was to be, would be. And he actually even scoffed at the level of military presence because he said that if he were meant to be lynched, then he would be lynched. That's just how it goes. Now, not long after arriving in Cleveland on the morning of February 4th, James was taken to the courthouse. It was a whirlwind of a day. This all went so fast. The grand jury selection process began at 9 o'clock that morning. The proceedings began at 10. He was officially indicted for the murders of both Aurelius and Luella Turner, though the trial was only going to be for the murder of Mrs. Turner. 2 defense attorneys were then assigned to represent James Coyner. The attorneys asked if they could have a quick recess to talk to their client, and the judge reluctantly agreed to let them have a noon recess for that. Initially, the judge was like, there are going to be no breaks. We're going straight into the trial. But then he was like, fine, you can make your acquaintance with your client. The trial began at 2 o'clock p.m. The state presented 7 witnesses. The defense had none. District Attorney Greek Rice showed actual pieces of salted and cured flesh from Mrs. Turner's body to the jury, which I find so bizarre. But I guess you would show that as evidence, right? I don't know. It seems, I don't know.
Or take pictures.
Yeah, maybe pictures. I would have to ask someone, would they actually do that? If you found a dismembered body, would you bring in the pieces?
No, you take pictures.
Right. Yeah. So that just seems weird, but they're like, here you go.
I wonder if they buried them after.
I don't know. Good question. But yeah, so the defense argued their case for a full 15 minutes. The jury only took 5 minutes to come back with a verdict of guilty. And so the entire thing that day, from start to finish, lasted for fewer than 11 hours, starting with grand jury selection at 9 and finishing at about 7:30 p.m. with the guilty verdict. So 1 hour after being convicted of the murder of Mrs. Luella Turner, James Coyner was back on the train with 200 guardsmen heading back to Jackson to the mob-proof jail. Back in his cell, he was not emotional at all and said he was ready to go to the gallows right now. Let's do this. Now, a week after his conviction, he was sitting in his cell writing letters to editors of newspapers, and he argued that his crime wasn't nearly as bad as lynchings committed by communities and cities. An article on February 11th mentioned that his mother, Letty Wheeler, had gone to the Jackson jail to visit her son for the first and only time, and they mentioned that she was just as tall as her son. So remember, he's 6'4", so she must have also been very, very tall.
Wow.
Yeah. On Saturday, March 2nd, James told newspapermen that he wanted to be cremated. He said that he couldn't bear to think of a corpse's decomposition and would rather be burned to dust than left to rot in a coffin.
Funny, because he was a grave robber.
I know. He dug up Elizabeth C., and she'd been buried for 10 years. Well, that won't be me. I'm too good for that. Yeah. But he also wrote his mom a letter in Cleveland and told her not to spend a single penny toward the handling of his body. Because if the family didn't claim the corpse after he was hanged, then it was state law that the county had to pay the cost of burial or cremation, like whatever they decided to do, which they decided not to cremate him because that would have been more money than they wanted to pay. So on March 4th, the day before his execution, James H. Coyner, born Alonzo Robinson, dressed up in a very fancy suit that he had purchased for himself with all the nickels that he'd collected. He had a photographer take a very nice picture of him, and James paid him to deliver both the suit and the developed photograph to his mother after his death.
Okay, I'm just going to say, when you first told me this, I think it's kind of sweet from a mom's perspective. Mm-hmm. Like, all his nickels for a suit and a nice picture. That's nice. He's not nice, but that's nice.
I'll cash in on my notoriety here and save up so I can send my mom my suit and a picture.
My heart.
He really loved his mom. Like, that was the only time he ever showed emotion at all, was when, her safety came into question. So he really was a mama's boy. Now, the execution was scheduled for March 5th, and they had to once again move the condemned man from Jackson, Mississippi to Cleveland, Mississippi for the event. And once again, the National Guard was called in to make sure no angry mobs could take over before justice was legally meted out. They kept the transfer details so hush-hush that even the National Guardsmen had no idea what the plan was. It was assumed that they would go by train again. But at the last minute, 2 Dixie Greyhound buses rolled up. Even just getting him onto the bus was a big ordeal. When they took him outside of the jail, he was surrounded by a detail of non-commissioned officers with their pistols drawn. He was heavily chained, and obviously he wasn't the threat they were worried about. They got him into one of 2 waiting vehicles, which then drove through deserted streets in Jackson to the National Guard Armory. There were guardsmen and police officers guarding the intersections around the jail so that the streets would be completely clear. The cars arrived at the armory, and James Coyner was taken inside. At about 7:30 p.m., that's when 2 large Dixie Greyhound buses pulled up to the armory. At 8:45 p.m., a passenger car sped up to a side entrance of the armory where one of the buses was parked. James came out with his hands cuffed behind him. He was pushed up into the bus by the officers. The lights inside the bus were ordered to be put out, and then dozens of National Guardsmen loaded onto both buses.
So what was the passenger car for?
It was the pilot car.
There was a storm that night, and the rain was coming down in sheets. This made driving very hazardous, and the caravan had to drive fairly slowly. There was a pilot car leading the way, then the bus that carried James H. Coyner, then the second bus with the rest of the troops. Behind the buses were 2 more passenger cars carrying staff officers and newspaper men. About 3 miles northwest of Flora, the pilot car took a wrong turn and wound up leading the caravan off the highway into a narrow local road. When they realized the mistake, they all had to back out of the road to get back to the highway. It wasn't wide enough for the buses to successfully turn around, so this was going to be very tricky. The 2 rear passenger cars got out just fine, but the rear bus wound up skidding and slid down into a ditch. Now, this bus was blocking the road, so the front bus and the pilot car couldn't get out at all. For 2 hours, they tried to get the rear bus back on the road, and they had no luck. Jackson, Mississippi was contacted, and a replacement bus was sent their way. Ultimately, they just had to push the disabled bus out of the way, and then the front bus and the pilot car could back out just fine. Troops were loaded onto the replacement bus, and they got back on the road to Cleveland.
It was a very long journey that night. Coyner spent his time talking to the soldiers. He smoked his cigarettes with them. At one point, he was actually third on a match, and the soldiers were wide-eyed due to the superstition.
Being third on a match meant that a person was the third one to use the same match while lighting their cigarette. This superstition began among those fighting in World War I. It was said that the first light alerts the enemy, the second allows them to aim, and the third invites them to open fire.
The superstition was that if someone was third on a match, that person would soon be met with death.
And that's where they were actually headed.
That's true. So the soldiers, while on the bus, they sang "Glory, Glory, Hallelujah," "My Wild Irish Rose," and "Hail, Hail, the gang's all here."
A gang of good fellows are we, are we, are we, are we, are we, are we.
James didn't sing along, but he did laugh at their attempts at harmony. The singing turned to joke-telling, and as the hours wore on, it got quiet because they were all very tired. James stared at the road ahead and kept asking soldiers beside him how far it was to Cleveland.
Are we almost there?
At 3:40 a.m., the caravan pulled into the courthouse yard right in front of the Bolivar County Jail in Cleveland, Mississippi. Again, the National Guardsmen had fortified the courthouse with barbed wire all around it, sandbags inside of the perimeter, and nests of machine guns on top of the building. James was first taken into the courthouse, which was next to the jail, and a police department photographer tried to get a picture of him. He squinted up his face and refused to allow for a picture. The reason they took him into the courthouse was because they thought he might be connected to more crimes than he'd yet admitted to, and they wanted to give him one last chance to get it all off his chest. But he told them he had nothing more to say. He was again asked if he'd had an accomplice when he slaughtered the Turner couple, and he again insisted that he had worked alone that night. He was only in the courthouse for a few minutes before he was rushed across the narrow yard to the jail, where they went right on ahead with the execution. From what I could gather from the articles, the jailhouse was 4 stories tall, and their execution room was at the very top floor of the jail. The gallows had been altered for this occasion because James Coyner, or Alonzo Robinson as he was born, was taller than any prisoner they'd hanged before. He was 6 foot 4 inches after all.
Based on data from World War I draft registration cards, the average height for American men born around 1895 was approximately 5 feet 8 inches.
Wow, so he was 8 inches taller than average. No wonder they kept calling him a giant. Well, they led him up a narrow staircase to the scaffold on the 4th floor. They immediately put a strap around his legs. James didn't seem concerned at all and just looked around the room in interest. Sheriff McLean began to read the death warrant to him, which is a standard procedure. James told him he didn't have to read it, but Sheriff McLean did it anyway. While McLean read the death warrant, James looked around the small crowd in the room and recognized Captain Virgil Adkins. He said,
"Why, hello, Captain. You weren't with us on the trip tonight."
Captain Adkins had commanded a special detail a month earlier when the trial happened. He responded and said that he'd gone straight to Cleveland this time, not to Jackson first. This little exchange happened while McLean was still reading the death warrant. McLean finished reading, and then he asked the prisoner,
Do you have anything to say, James?
He said,
Nothing. Don't you want to pray? How can I pray when there's no preacher here?
The Black Hood was then brought over to put on his head, and he moved his head to the side a little and asked,
Where is the minister?
Sheriff McLean said,
We don't have to have one.
while he adjusted the covering over his face. Deputy Sheriff Charlie Maddox, one of the men who had arrested James at the post office back on January 12th, slipped the noose over his head. He had placed the knot below and slightly behind his left ear. Then Sheriff McLean reached for the lever and sprang the trap. James's body dropped a full 6 feet before the rope became taut. His body had twisted slightly when he started to fall, and that brought the knot of the noose forward and under his chin. When the rope was tight, the knot snapped his head backward.
Ugh. Mm.
Do you think I should cut that out?
No. But wow.
Yeah. And I keep imagining that in my head. It's like, ooh. But it was in the paper, so, throwing it in. All right, so it was exactly 3:59 a.m. when the trap was sprung, about 29 minutes after having just arrived in Cleveland. Now, because Sheriff McLean was also a physician, it was he who checked the body and declared him dead 9 minutes later. The 30-ish people who had witnessed the execution, including Aurelius's brother and Luella's father, they were all told to exit the jail after he was pronounced dead. They'd been lining the narrow staircase that led up to the execution room at the top of the jail. It was so narrow and the room was so small that the spectators were lining the stairway from the 2nd floor to the 4th. So when I read this, it made me think that there must have been vaulted ceilings or some kind of other open construction in the jail to make this possible. And that's why I reached out to the Historical Society in Bolivar County to ask about that, but they weren't sure. Well, actually, no, the reason I reached out was to find out where he's buried. And then I asked this question. So, yeah. Anyway, we're going to send this episode to them and they can share with their people if they want to. So the people all filed down to the ground floor. The casket that was waiting for James's body was actually sitting in the doorway from the ground floor to the courtyard outside. It was blocking the doorway in such a way that every person had to actually step into the casket in order to get out of the building. And because of the torrential rains going on in Mississippi that night, the bottom of the casket wound up covered in muddy footprints. Sheriff McLean decided he would like to save the rope for future use, so they untied the knot of the noose rather than cutting the rope. It took about 5 minutes to get this done, and then James's body was removed to the ground floor of the jail and placed into the plain pine casket. As per his own instructions, his family members declined to claim his body. So, the sheriff's deputies took the body to the county poor farm to be buried in a potter's field. There were no religious ceremonies, no flowers, and no family members present at the burial. Within minutes of the hanging, a shrill military whistle was sounded in the courtyard, calling all 600 troops to order and back into rank and file for their departure. When the buses were loaded, they were all driven to Indianola, 35 miles south of Cleveland, where they would eat breakfast before heading to their respective homes. By sunrise on March 5th, the soldiers were all gone. The barbed wire came down and the courthouse returned to normal. Alonzo Robinson, the giant, was buried in a potter's field, but Flora Merlene, Aurelius Jr., and little Jimmy lived on.
Flora Merlene Turner, Aurelius Burns Turner Jr., and little James Spencer Turner moved in with an aunt and uncle after the murders of their parents. Young Aurelius's name was legally changed to William Ernest Turner. Each of them lived full lives with families of their own. Merlene lived until 1993, William Ernest lived until 1981, and little Jimmy lived until 1998.
So again, this case is not forgotten. If you simply search for the name Alonzo Robinson, you will find information about all of this and the massive military presence at the courthouse. But like so many stories from the early 20th century, this story has been reshaped over time. The story has been twisted and turned into a tidy, attractive version that raises eyebrows and prompts one to keep reading. Today, Alonzo Robinson is remembered as a, quote, suspected serial killer who likely had up to 6 victims. Now, it's tempting to turn historical facts into mysterious speculation, but the reality just isn't there. The police in 1927 and again in 1934 admitted that there were no murders and no bodies to tie those skulls to. They were perfectly satisfied when their convicted grave robber admitted to having robbed graves. Those 4 skulls, however, Coyner said that he'd gotten them all from graves around Ferndale, Michigan. I'm not so sure, however. After all, 3 of those skulls were wrapped in newspapers from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Shout out.
Woo.
Shout out to newspapers.com, as always. Findagrave.com.
Yep. Love them.
Family Search. Ancestry.com. Pixabay. I'm assuming you used Pixabay.
I use Pixabay for sound effects every time. We should include them all the time.
Internet Archives. And follow our socials. Forgotten Felonies on Facebook. And Forgotten_Felonies on Instagram. And Forgotten_Felonies on Threads. And send us some requests at forgottenfelonies@gmail.com. Or through our fan mail website.
Yeah.
Oh, also shout out to Christian.
Oh, yes, for all the quotes. He had to do so many different voices this time. There were many different people talking.
And leave some comments. Rate us. Share with your friends.
Yes.
Start discussions on Facebook.
Yes, you can. You guys can post in the Facebook group too. You know, it's not just me posting pictures. You can say stuff. I talk back. I respond to people. I'm alive. So.
Really? You're not AI?
Nope. No, I'm not. So, well, cool. This was fun.
Yes, and soon we'll probably go back to every 2 weeks.
Yes. Right now, you're just doing cool.
I am.
Stuff. Dance competition judging.
That finishes end of March.
Yep.
We need a cult.
I found a good cult.
You did. That one guy.
And then I found that other guy. And I was like, oh my gosh. But the second one, there wasn't really a felony. But the first one, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh.
We should try to find cults from different countries too.
Yeah. It's crazy how many cults there are going back, you know? It's like, where did this one come from?
Yeah. Did you fix Alonzo's Wikipedia page, or you just...
I didn't do the Wikipedia page, but I did his Find a Grave. I was like, in the note to the person, I was like, just correcting the record. It drives me crazy. But...
Sorry, you're wrong.
Yeah, I don't know who wrote it, but I mean, they're probably going off Wikipedia. I'll have to see where Wikipedia was citing their source from or whatever. It just drives me insane. It literally says on Wikipedia, it says like headless bodies started showing up in 1926 and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I looked, I saw that you said that. I went looking all over. No, there were not. And you'd think if there was a headless body, you know, let alone 4, it would have been in the paper. You know what I mean? They also found pieces of flesh. They were salted and cured. One piece actually had a bite taken out of it.
I want to know how she didn't know that.
I don't know. Maybe they prepared their meals separately. Oh! I'm a terrible person.
Yep.